Why did Abraham believe? Because by the time that God had made this promise to him, Abraham had walked with God for many years. And that was the evidence, if you will. In other words, God had shown himself to be true to Abraham and Sarah. He had come through in really difficult times of trial. And so by the time that God makes this promise, Abraham really trusts God. He really believes that if God says something, I can trust it. So as it says here in Romans, he didn't waver in his faith. This is the faith that we're talking about in Hebrews 1, this assurance of things hoped for. I want to have a child. I want to be the father of a great nation. I really hope for that. So it's the assurance of that, but it's based on the object here, which is the reliability of God himself and the promises of God. Hi, friends. This is Scott Allen, president of the Disciple Nations Alliance, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences, the podcast of the Disciple Nations Alliance. As we prepare to launch my newest book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meaning of Our Most Important Words, we wanted to go through each one of these 10 foundational words that are highlighted in the book, discussing their true meaning, as well as how they've been fundamentally redefined in our contemporary culture. Now, you might be asking, why do words matter? Well, it's because words and definitions shape the way we think and feel, and that in turn determines our choices and our actions. And that shapes the kind of culture that we live in, for better or for worse. And so, if you want to work for a positive change in culture, in society, it has to begin by restoring the true meaning of our most important words.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode on this mini-series on the new book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meanings of Our Most Important Words. We're so glad that you guys have chosen to join us today. My name is Luke, and I am sitting here in our virtual studio with Dwight Vogt and Scott Allen, the author of the new book, which, again, is called 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World. Just before we jump into today's discussion, I just wanted to give a quick shout-out to one of our consistent listeners here on the show. We just connected with you this last week. You are a missionary from the Philippines serving in Vietnam, and you reached out to us this last week, and now we're working on a project together, so glad to make that connection. Like this listener, for the rest of you guys out there, if you'd like to connect with us, if you guys have a question or a query or a comment, or if you'd like to recommend a topic for the show or a guest, we would be honored to connect with each and every one of you guys. There's a lot of ways that you guys can do that. You can leave us a comment on the episode page, which we always have those linked in the show notes. You can also reach out to us on social media. We are the Disciple Nations Alliance on Instagram and Facebook. Or you can always send us a good old-fashioned email. We are info@disciplenations.org on email, and we check all of those regularly. So please reach out. We always love hearing from you guys here on the show. By the way, if you're wondering what the Disciple Nations Alliance is, that's the ministry behind this podcast, Ideas Have Consequences. This is a ministry that has been around for 27 years-ish now. It's a global nonprofit that's served in over 90 nations to over 1 million people, training on the power of a biblical worldview. Speaking of a biblical worldview, this book, which we are unpacking during this series, again titled 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, begins each chapter by laying out 2 definitions of each of these important words. One of those definitions being the true definition, which comports with God's view of the world, aka the biblical worldview, and then contrasts that with our contemporary skewed redefinitions of these words, and encourages us to point our view back towards God's view of these words, and also points out the devastation of not doing that. So that said, today's word in focus is faith. So Dad, just to open us up, would you mind giving us those 2 definitions of this word?
Yeah, great. Good to be with you, Dwight and Luke. I'm super excited to talk about faith today. Such an important word, and so much to unpack here and get into. Just starting with the 2 definitions. So the true definition of faith, as at least I've attempted to concisely define it, is that faith is affirming the truthfulness of something. Excuse me, I'm starting with the wrong one. Cut, take two. Cut. All right, let's start. The true definition of faith is to assent to the weight of evidence, to trust in the truthfulness and the reliability of something or someone based on a careful search of available evidence and personal experience. So it's very similar to the word trust. Just trust and faith are synonymous in many ways. Mm-hmm. So faith, as it's been redefined in our culture, however, is very different. My concise definition there is faith is affirming the truthfulness of something without regards to evidence or even despite a lack of evidence. So it's trusting in something even without any evidence for that. So it redefined faith is almost entirely thought of as a religious faith. It's the blind leap of faith that we sometimes hear people speak about.
Yeah, blind faith. Yeah. You hear that all the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So those are the two. Yeah, and I would say that the redefined faith, this false view of faith, really is dominant now in Western society. It's this idea that faith is personal, subjective. It's a personal, subjective religious belief that doesn't really have any grounding in facts or evidence. So yeah, we can get into that.
Yeah, you actually speak of blind faith as one of those examples. Maybe you could give examples of the false definition, Scott.
Yeah, a couple of quotes that kind of get into it. Mark Twain, a famous American writer, once quipped, "Having faith is believing in something you just know ain't true." I thought that was a good way of putting it. Okay. Couple more quotes. Actually, this one comes from the Oxford Dictionary of the English Language. This is fascinating. If you open up that dictionary, which is really one of the foundational English dictionaries, it defines faith this way. Faith is a strong belief in God or the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than on proof.
Where'd you get that from?
That's actually how faith is defined in the Oxford Dictionary of the English Language.
Okay.
So again, that really has captured our understanding of what faith is, and I would say even in the church, largely that people believe that. Like I always think of Darrow, our friend Darrow, coworker Darrow. He often talks about when he went to L'Abri as a young man and was confronted by Udo Middleman there, and Udo, they were having some discussion over, a glass of wine late into the evening, and Udo kind of said to Darrow at one point, "Darrow, Christianity's true even if you don't believe it," and that
even
created this even if nobody believed it, and that created a crisis of faith for Darrow because he said, "I always was taught in the church that it's true because I believe it." In other words, it's just that's what it's this very personal, subjective belief in something, regardless of proof or evidence. So, anyways,
and when I hear you talk about the false definition, I just think of it's almost like faith has become a pejorative in the sense that it's the opposite of reason and evidence.
It's the opposite of it. Exactly, Dwight.
To lack reason, to lack evidence is to have faith.
Exactly.
And the other is to have is the idea of mindless faith. And so I just believe and you will be healed, and and you'll have money, and just believe. And that's
right. Well, there's that. You have that in the church today, this kind of idea of faith in faith, just the power of belief. If I just believe, we'll get into this later, but faith, just to make any sense of it at all, has to have an object. In other words, faith is trust in something or somebody, right? That's the object. Just to have faith in faith is kind of nonsensical, right? But that's very common today in the church. If you just believe, miracles will happen, great things will happen. How? through faith, through faith.
Right.
Well, if you ask faith in what? Well, no, faith in, whatever it is.
Faith and faith.
Faith and faith. Faith is the thing, yeah.
Scott, our listeners haven't seen a video yet, but you do have a video on this word faith, and you use a really good illustration when you unpack that at the beginning, and you talk about the airplane, having faith in an airplane. I think why don't you share that a bit?
Sure. Well, yeah, that's getting us back to kind of what faith is, the true definition of faith, and let me jump up here to that a little bit. So basically what I'm saying is that, first of all, I think it's important for Christians especially, and I know most people that listen to our podcast are Christians, we Christians tend to think of faith in religious terms. It's saving faith in Jesus Christ, or it's sola fide, right? The Reformation cry, by faith alone. And so we think of faith in terms of religion, and that's reinforced in the culture, right? Just these definitions that we've just looked at. Very often, scientific materialists will say, "Yeah, I believe in reason, but you Christians, you believe in faith," right? It's just this blind leap of faith. So we tend to we associate faith with religion really closely. But I want us to not do that, because faith isn't in any way something that is particular to religion. It's something that everyone actually exercises all the time. You have to exercise faith in order to just function in the world. You can't hardly even get up in the morning and start a day without exercising faith. So what do I mean by faith? It's again, the true definition is to put your trust in something or someone based on the weight of evidence. So it's synonymous with trust, with trustworthiness. And yeah, the example that you're alluding to, Dwight, is I give the example of airline travel, something that most people have done, and so let's say you want to, if you've never flown before, you might have questions. And all faith, by the way, starts with questions. And the question in this case is, will that airline safely get me to where I want to go? Can I trust it to get me there without crashing or whatever it is, And so in order to for faith to work, you begin to answer that question in a search for evidence. Do I know people that have flown safely? Can I trust in the reliability of airplanes? Maybe I'll talk to a pilot. You're going to just gather some evidence in your own mind. This can happen kind of quickly too. It doesn't have to be some big research project. You just start gathering evidence, and that's the beginning point of an exercise of faith. But faith, what makes faith kind of unique is when this word assent is really important. When you finally assent to the weight of the evidence, meaning, everything that I see here, everything that I'm looking at points to the fact that, yeah, this airplane can get me safely to where I want to go. But it's not faith unless you actually get on the plane, right? And actually take that trip. That's the assent point, right?
Would you say that's the little bit of the difference between trust and faith? Because they're obviously different words. Is you trust that plane is going to get you to where you want to go, but then when you step on the plane, that's the faith, the action.
Yeah,
maybe?
That's the assent, and that is kind of the essence of faith, Luke. Is you can say, "Oh, I trust that plane," but if you never got on it, people would go, "Doesn't seem like you trust it. You actually haven't flown." But if you actually do get on the plane, you assent to the weight of the evidence. You get on the plane, you fly, and then, by the way, if you get there successfully, that strengthens your faith, because now that faith is strengthened through your own personal experience with it. And the more you fly, obviously, the stronger your faith grows, Again, this is something that we do all the time. It's even... You look at a chair when you come into a room, and you look at that chair. If it's an older chair, like an antique chair, you might go, "Is that going to support me?" And you've got some evidence that you bring to that, based on, you look at it, you're going to collect some evidence really quickly but then you exercise faith by sitting in the chair, right? Sitting down in it, So faith always has an object. It's the trust in an object like an airplane or a chair or God, by the way. Or you're an auto mechanic. There's so many examples. You come to a new town. I'm living in a relatively new town. I've got to get my car fixed. The question that arises, faith always starts with questions. Can I trust that mechanic, right? So I'm going to gather some evidence, do some research, and ultimately bring my car down. That's the assent, and if they repair the car in a good way, honestly, cost effective, then, I can trust that person. I have faith in that person. So it's just so important to think about faith in a very simple, practical way, because this isn't just something that religious people have. All people have faith. We exercise faith all the time. You can't function in this world without that level of trust. And I'm sorry, just to ramble a little bit longer, but the biblical word for faith in the Old Testament, anyways, is emet, or emeth, which is almost identical to the word truth. And truth in the Old Testament it's that idea of something that's immovable, that's firm, that's fixed, that's solid, that's trustworthy, right? Okay. So this is the idea. Like Dwight, I've known you for years. I can totally trust you. Why? Because you've proven yourself to be trustworthy over a long, set of years and experiences.
It's a very strong word.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of your chair analogy, and I've sat in some chairs, and I hoped they would hold me up.
Right.
But I didn't necessarily have faith in them, and I sat down on it anyway.
Yeah.
But you're saying faith is, I know that chair is strong, and I know it will hold me. And
you're assenting to the weight of the evidence, right? So there's never. This is where faith becomes kind of important, because there's very few things we can actually know for certain in this world, right? And this is where we actually all have to kind of exercise some faith, based on. But faith, and again, the New Testament word for faith is very helpful here. The word is pistis, which means evidence. Isn't that interesting? It means it's a search based on available evidence. So, for example, the Apostle Paul says that unless Jesus actually, I don't have the verse in front of me, but unless he actually rose from the dead, your faith is in vain, right? So it has to be based on actual evidence of something that really happened in history. And if that didn't really happen, if Jesus wasn't a real person, didn't die on a cross, didn't rise from the dead, then we don't have any basis for our Christian faith. It's a fable, it's a myth. But the basis is, no, this was an actual historical event. It actually happened. We can know something about it through the same way that we study history and the reliability of anything that happened in history, So it means it just means evidence. It means, there's real evidence for this. And so, go ahead.
And right there, you just pivoted from a definition of the word faith to you qualified it. So now we're talking Christian faith. So what does it mean to have Christian faith? And it's to have confidence in the evidence of God, of a good God, of Christ, that Christ lived, died, rose again. Anyway, that's how I see you tying those two together now.
That's right. Christian faith is just faith. Again, faith starts with questions, and so the questions that Christian faith start with are questions, really big questions. Does God exist? Is God revealed in the Bible? Is the Bible been passed down reliably? Can I trust it? As a truthful source of reality? Is Jesus who he claimed to be? So Christian faith starts with these kinds of questions, and then it's looking for evidence for their truthfulness. So this is the whole realm of apologetics, and there's a degree to which all of our faith needs to be based on this stuff isn't a fable, this isn't a myth. This actually, Jesus lived, he was who he said he was. There's real evidence for that. and you can make a case for that. Now, Christian faith, though, does go beyond that in the sense that, that we, in our fallen condition, we're so blinded to the truth that we need God's help in order to see things truthfully, to answer those questions about Jesus affirmatively. The New Testament especially says you need the enlightenment of the Holy Spirit. In other words, we don't come to this just through some exercise of reason, and we have got spiritual blinders on. But I think one of the most famous verses when we're talking about Christian faith, one of the most famous verses in the Bible is faith is, I think it's in Hebrews, right? Faith is the confidence in what we hope for, the assurance of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. That's Hebrews chapter 11, the beginning of that, right? Faith, this is the great faith passage, right, in the New Testament. And, that sometimes that passage has struck me as being a little bit unclear. Faith is the confidence in what we hope for, the assurance about what we do not see. So I ask myself the question, what's the object of the faith that we're talking about in this verse? And the object of the faith that we're talking about, the confidence in that which we hope for, is it's God himself. And I think we're specifically talking about the promises of God in the Scripture. God makes all these promises. And faith, essentially, speaking of this passage, is faith. It's confidence in the promises of God. It's assurance that those promises are reliable and that they'll come true. So that chapter goes on and talks about the hall of faith, all these people that put their trust in the promises of God and were able to face all sorts of hardships as a result. And one of those people is Abraham. Abraham is talked about in the Bible as the great man of faith, right? And and Abraham exercises faith in a lot of different ways, right? It talks about this in Romans chapter 4, verse 19 and 22. It says that without weakening in his faith, Abraham faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb, his wife, was also dead because they were so old. And then it goes on, it says, yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God. What's the promise here? God says, you will be the father of a great nation, right? He made a promise to Abraham. You will be the father of a great nation. When he made that promise, Abraham was old. He was beyond childbearing age, and so was Sarah. So it was, it was hard to believe, right, this one. But Abraham did believe. Why did Abraham believe? Because by the time that God had made this promise to him, Abraham had walked with God for many years. And it was that was the evidence, if you will. In other words, God had shown himself to be true to Abraham and Sarah. He had come through in really difficult times of trial. And so by the time that God makes this promise, Abraham really trusts God. He right. really believes in that if God says something, I can trust it. That's going to be completely reliable. So as it says here in Romans, he didn't waver in his faith. This is the faith that we're talking about in Hebrews 1, this assurance of things hoped for. I want to have a child. I want to be the father of a great nation. I really hope for that. So it's the assurance of that, but it's based on this, the object here, which is the reliability of God himself and the promises of God, right? So
I think that's a really important distinction. Yeah, that verse doesn't reflect mindless faith.
No,
but just your pointing that he believed in the object of God because he'd heard from God.
Right.
He heard him when he said, "Leave your land and go to a new one."
Yes,
and he had those years of experience with God, and so
it comes out later too, in the really famous story of God comes to Abraham and Sarah later and says, sacrifice your son Isaac,
right.
And Abraham takes Isaac and goes to Mount Moriah and goes all the way through with it to the point of raising the knife over him. And my contention is that Abraham, even at that moment, knew that he could have utter trust in God's promise that his son Isaac would be the forefather of this great nation, and that God would provide a way. Even then, in fact, I think it says that much. Where is that? I've got that verse here in front of me here too, but. Yeah, maybe I don't, but yeah, he doesn't waver in his faith. He has utter trust in God, and it's really no different. Paul says this in the New Testament. This is no different than faith in the New Testament. It's just trust in God, trust in the fact that he exists, that he's true, that he's solid, immovable, firm. He doesn't change his mind. He's not the same. He's not different yesterday than he is today. And it's this just complete trust in him, but it's not a blind thing. It's based on historical reality, scientific reality, all sorts of evidence, that we have. And then, of course, we assent to that. We trust in God. We put our full faith in him. And then we bring to that personal experience, right? Like, God's been really faithful in my life,
right?
And so my faith grows in that sense, yeah.
Let me see if I'm keeping up with you here. This word for me has been really helpful to learn about during this project, because growing up in the church, I think I just kind of accidentally did not do a good job defining this word well. I just kind of absorbed the definitions from people I heard around me. I think, it's so easy to do that with a lot of these words as Christians.
Yes.
Is we just, in our church bubbles, in our Christian bubbles, we hear truth all the time, we hear faith all the time, we hear love, and we just kind of think we know the definitions well enough, but they're actually just the churchy answers, and if anyone pushes back on them, especially a non-Christian, we kind of crumble, and we don't have a good way of defending them. Which, by the way, knowing the true definitions of these words is a really helpful apologetic tool for Christians. If you can just know the simple, true definitions of a word like truth. Truth is extremely similar with reality, and just knowing that helps a lot when explaining these words to critics. And with faith, knowing that it's the assent to the weight of evidence, and it's not blind. Just if you can say that much and then back it up a little bit, will give you a much firmer understanding in what you believe and why you believe it. Anyways, I had a pretty bad definition of this. I would say, even up to 6 months ago, just not really well defined. So this has been helpful. Anyways, to see if I can staying on track with you guys here, we were talking about faith in general, how everyone needs faith. Pretty much everything we do in life requires faith. Eating a sandwich, hoping it's not poisoned, like you guys said, sitting in a chair, hopping in a car, whatever that looks, anything historical, we have to have faith that someone was actually accurate in writing down that Alexander the Great was a real person that actually existed. Right. When it comes to our belief in God, unlike sitting in a chair, we can't exactly use math and sitting in a chair, I can just grab some weights and throw them on the chair and see if it holds the same weight as me. We have perfect data in a way to support the fact that chair is going to hold me. So there's not much faith there. But with God, he gives us a lot of evidence, like you were saying, Dad, through science and through creation and through history
itself,
and through lived experience from other people. There's tons of evidence there. Right. The whole Bible, his word. But there's not full, perfect evidence. Sometimes you hear that from skeptical atheists. If you guys could prove perfectly that God existed, then I would believe. Yeah. And to that, I would say that's where faith comes in. And he's given us plenty, but he hasn't given us the perfect amount of evidence. He's not going to show up to every single person and say, "Hi, I'm Jesus," like some people wish he would. Like he actually did that, and still people at that time didn't believe him.
That's right.
And he performed miracles. He did everything you would expect a God to do, and yet people still didn't believe in him. But today, we say, I just want perfect amount of evidence and data and facts that he is real. But he doesn't do that on purpose, right? And it's because he wants loving relationship. And we all know that you need faith in order to have loving relationship. And see if this analogy works for you guys here. I think of faith a lot of times in human relationship as being a helpful example for a relationship with God. Before I got married, I knew a lot of evidence that my wife was a great person and loved me and was headed in the right direction. And yet I didn't know fully that in 20 years she wouldn't be, some crazy person. I didn't know that, but I had to have faith and commit, take that step, say the vows. We're married now. But I didn't know perfectly.
Yeah, the marriage is such a good example here of faith, Luke, because
I haven't got to my analogy yet.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So God wants a loving relationship with us, right? So with that, he wants to see us have some faith in him. In the same way that if I didn't have faith in my wife and I made it, and I had to have perfect evidence always that she's being faithful to me. Let's say I track her phone, I follow her everywhere I go, I read all of her texts, I look at her Google search. I have perfect evidence to support my confidence in our marriage, but there's not faith there that I'm not trusting her, and it's that trust, that amount of trust that shows that I love her as well. And God wants to see us. He doesn't give us perfect evidence in a way, full perfect evidence that he exists, so that we can take that step of faith and trust in him. And that's a loving step of trust. I may be getting off track here. That's just where my brain was going as you guys were talking. But
well, what I hear you saying is just that relationship is a great example of faith. Every relationship is an example of faith because we're trusting that person will be who they were last time we talked to them. They'll be honest. They'll be straightforward. Yeah, we have to have faith to have a relationship.
Yeah, and the depth of the relationship, you're going to reveal more about yourself as you know that person can be trusted with what if you're sharing something that's makes you weak and vulnerable, you have to, that person needs to be trustworthy, with that, so they don't harm you or damage you with what you're entrusting to them. And and I think another thing you're saying, Luke, here that I want to just comment on is, I don't have, people want perfect, you use that word several times, perfect evidence, complete, completely buttoned down. That doesn't exist anywhere, I would say. Guys, do you agree with me? So we often think, well, science, right? Trust the science. Science has really proven it. But even scientists will tell you that's not real, right? Every hypothesis, you can... is open to being disproven, right? It's never completely buttoned down. Science just wouldn't exist in that way. Now you can know things, the laws of gravity. There's a lot of evidence for that. So we can know some of those things with a lot of confidence, let's say. But even, I just think that that's not the kind of world we live in where you can know anything completely or perfectly. So in that respect, you do have to exercise faith. Everyone does. Science is based on faith, in a sense. Faith that, I'm going to make a hypothesis, I'm going to test it, and,
and scientists exercise faith continuously because no scientist can do all the research on a project. They have to have some other people helping them out, lean on the law of gravity and, just, have faith that actually is real, not test it for themselves, because that'd take way too long.
Yeah.
I believe that guy and I listen to this guy and I believe him. And, you compile a lot of faith in order to exercise upon your hypothesis.
Yeah. So, and then just one last comment about Luke's marriage analogy. I think it's really good because we all, right, to get married is an act of faith because you don't know everything about a person that you're marrying. You can't. There's such depth to who someone is. I mean, I've been married now for, more than 30 years and I still don't know everything about my wife, Kim. So it's a step of faith, but the actual assent, the essence of faith is, standing up and saying, I do, you're committing yourself then fully based on weight of evidence that I can trust this person. You know what I'm saying? So it's a good analogy. And it's the same thing we do with God. It requires, saving faith requires that, full commitment, right? You could say, I believe, I've done all the research and looked at all the evidence, and I believe Jesus is who he said he was, and that we can trust him completely. But unless you do actually fully put your trust in him, surrender your life to Him, you haven't reached that point of true faith, I would say. So just a couple of clarifications. Dwight, you were going to say
Scott,
something.
usually at this point you talk about the cultural implications of the false definition. How has it impacted? What's happened in our world since faith has been changed in terms of its definition?
Absolutely. Well, before I answer that, I wanted to just add one more, because we're talking about true definition of faith here, and I think this is important. I just want to, if you don't mind me just going on a little bit of a detour, I think the church has been quite affected by this false definition of faith, this idea that you've just got to believe, right? It's just belief and belief. And as a result of that, sometimes young people especially are told, don't ask questions, just believe. Don't think too hard, right? That's kind of, you might lose your faith, I think, is kind of what's behind some of that. Like, you don't want to think.
Look for evidence.
Don't think too hard. Just believe. You just believe. This is kind of what Darrow was taught as a young man. And I think it's still very much true in the church. But this is not good or healthy. And I think there's a real place to, it's important, actually. Faith begins with questions. And so you have to ask these questions. And, this is something that Darrow learned at L'Abri, again, with Francis Schaeffer, who famously said, there's no such thing as a bad question. Just ask your questions. So we have to be really, it's a great thing to have this questioning, inquiring mind. Is it true? Can I trust it? All Christians have to have a genuine faith. They should answer, they should be free to ask those questions, let's just say. So I just think that's really important. Now, there is a point at which asking questions becomes counterproductive. If you've got all of the evidence, but you still keep doubting, I think that doubt then is kind of like the doubt that James talks about, this wave that tosses you to and fro. It's like at some point you've got to assent. You've got to take that step. And if you just keep doubting, that there's something kind of unhealthy and destructive about that. But asking hard questions to build a foundation for your faith is really, really important. So
that's interesting. Yeah, you can have all the evidence, all the right answers, read the Bible 10 times through.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, Satan knows all the evidence.
Right.
For Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't believe. He's got perfect theology in a way. Yeah, he doesn't believe. So, there's that point at which you need to stop. You need to assent. Yeah, I'd like
assent.
You to say assent to it.
Put your full trust, essentially surrender is what it, looks like. I surrender my entire life, all that I am to you, Jesus. Do with me what you will, not my will, but yours be done. That idea, that's the call, right? When we're talking about when we're talking about faith exercised, in that airplane analogy, it's getting on the plane. That's the assent. The assent, when we're asking about, is Jesus really who he said he was? If the answer is yes, based on the weight of evidence, then that means he's God. He's your creator. He's and if that's true, the only proper assent response is total surrender on your part, right? So, but Dwight, back to your question about cultures, again, Darrow is fond of saying, go ahead.
I think what you just said is one example. It's the idea that because we bought into the idea that faith and reason are disconnected, there's the idea that if you do reason yourself to faith, it's not real. Or it's this idea that I can't actually have faith and reason working together.
Yes, right. Yeah. They go together. This idea that's the redefined faith that separates faith and reason or faith and science is false. That just has to be understood really clearly. That is a false distinction that came out of the Enlightenment. They go together. There is no war between faith and science, or Christianity and science. There is no.
Could you explain that to people? You said the Enlightenment is where this lie probably started. I agree with that. Lay that out for people.
So when I'm talking about this period of Western history that kind of happened at the early 1700s, late 1600s, early 1700s, right after the Renaissance Reformation period, where there was this explosion of knowledge through science. And I think we've talked about this. Science itself, the practice of science, is something that was birthed out of a biblical worldview. There's certain presuppositions that you need biblically in order even to do science, and we could talk about those maybe at a different time. But science, my point here, science isn't bad at all. It's great. It's a study for what's true, what is true. And but science at this time in history was picking up a lot of momentum. It was just uncovering lots of mysteries, things that weren't known, like think about the thunder, lightning and thunder. Well, in the past, maybe that was the voice of the gods. Well, now we know that it's electrons and, and it's so it was that idea that because these great mysteries of the natural world were being kind of uncovered one by one, that this idea kind of crept in, that this kind of human hubris, right, of that, well, we don't really need to appeal to God anymore as an explanation for things. That's what they did during the quote-unquote Dark Ages. Now we've got this powerful tool of science and human reason. This is the Enlightenment period. And through science and human reason alone, we can know all of reality. That was so that was the kind of the basis of the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment secularism. We no longer need to appeal to God. God is a myth, a fairy tale, right? And now we trust the science, right? And we still hear this today. So during that time, the Enlightenment myth says that faith, then religious faith and belief in God is this blind leap, right, that we talked about, right? It's not based on any science, any evidence. It's just you believe it because you want to believe it because it makes you feel good, right? Gives you some hope or whatever it is. But it's just pure, it's just this belief without any kind of foundation in it, So, yeah, it put forward this idea of a war, right? There's this war between science and religion, because religion is illogical and science is logical. So all of that is false, right? And we have to go back to that and say, no, science was born out of a Judeo-Christian or biblical worldview. There is no war between science and faith. Everyone exercises faith. Faith is, even scientists exercise faith. So we just have to reject this kind of hypothesis that they put forward that, faith is a blind leap and, it's not in the realm of science. None of that is true. We have to reject, that has to be rejected. So, sorry, kind of a long answer.
So what happens when we fall for the Enlightenment myth to us and our cultures?
Well, I think you get all sorts of dysfunctions both in science and in the church. Let's just take science, for example, here first. We have this irony today where you have some big names in science, like, Richard Dawkins, for example, the famous British biologist, atheist biologist, and he's kind of got this quote that he's famous for saying that biology is the study of things that have the appearance of being designed, but actually aren't, So he's looking at, biological organisms, animals, people, plants, and he's saying, wow, they display all sorts of evidence of design. There's purpose, there's intricacy, there's this, complexity, there's all this information within the DNA molecule. Like, it looks like it's designed. Like, this didn't just happen by accident, That's what he's saying. But then he goes on and he kind of asserts that they actually aren't designed. That actually, even though there's all this evidence of design, these things weren't actually designed. They just happened, by blind chance. So you've got this weird irony where this great man of science is actually, what's he doing? He's exercising faith as a blind leap. Why? Because he doesn't want to believe in God. So you get a lot of that happening in science today. They're doing it's scientism. In other words, it's almost this religious belief in science. But what it's striving for is to say there's no room in the universe for God or, any kind of spiritual reality. That's what they want to believe, and they use science. So it's almost up to Christians and a recovery of faith, true faith, to say, no, we really do care about science. We want to save science. Science is following the evidence wherever it leads with that, and then assent. Like if he truly assented to the evidence, he would believe in God because the evidence overwhelmingly points to a designer, right? I mean, there's just no question about that at this point.
Mm. Yeah, true scientists are humble enough to recognize this. There's a famous neuroscientist right now named Andrew Huberman. Most of our listeners probably know who that is. And he's studied the brain his whole life. And he's at a point now when recently he was asked, do you believe in God? And he's like, I know too much to not believe in him.
Yes.
And I've studied science well enough to realize this has to come from an intelligent
way
designer.
Too much evidence, right? That just couldn't, none of this could have happened through some kind of this idea that you just, these particles and material building blocks are just kind of, if you just give them enough time, they'll all kind of assemble themselves into these highly complex, organisms and things like eyes and brains. And no, that requires way too much. That requires way too much blind faith. Let's say,
I think,
right.
As I'm listening to you, I also think when I hear the word faith, I'm going back to the beginning.
Yeah.
It's you mentioned scientism, and then there's spiritualism. And when I think of faith,
yes,
I think
this is I was talking about how faith today, this wrong definition of faith, it distorts science and it distorts true Christian faith.
But if I have to create categories, I put faith in the area of spiritualism. It's the idea that there's something beyond material world that is real and active, and what is that? And it could be animistic belief, it could be pantheism, it could be Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever. But there's voodoo, black magic. I don't know, but faith fits in that world. And so, where am I going with this? It's interesting because I think even the material world is. You mentioned the neuropsychologist or the neurobiologist. Even the material world is up against the question of isn't there something beyond matter? And it's the mind. It's it's design. It's your quote with Dawkins. And there's this. We're constantly confronted with this idea. Yes, there is something beyond matter.
Yeah, that's right.
Even in I love science. Reading intelligent design stuff, and increasingly. Darwinianism is losing ground because even now they're saying cells have cognition.
Yes.
Well, as soon as you say that a cell has cognition, you're going, a cell thinks. It has something that isn't material. It's not consciousness per se, but it's something.
Right.
And now you're into that spiritual realm, that non-material realm. But anyway, I just think it's interesting that I don't know what this has to do with faith, but the idea that there's evidence for this realm beyond what we see and feel and touch.
Oh yeah, no, I absolutely. I think for me, Dwight, where I saw this really clearly was there's a whole new field of science called information. The study of information, complex information, and it's kind of we think about these things that are really the basic building blocks of reality. We can think of material building blocks, electrons and protons and neutrons and quarks, and as small as you can get, there's these basic building blocks, these fundamental building blocks. And science now is saying there's another one too that's immaterial. It's information, and they often point to the DNA molecule, and they say the DNA molecule contains more information, complex, specified, instructions, if you will, that. More information is contained in the DNA molecule than the entire Encyclopedia Britannica 10 times over, or something like that. There's so much information, and then the question becomes, where does that come from? Where does this complex, specified information come from? And the answer is there's only one place that we know of where that comes from. That's from a mind.
Exactly.
Right? We can create information by writing I can write a book or a paragraph. That's complex, specified information, something that you can read. It's information. It's not just random characters on a piece of paper that make no sense. So it comes from my mind. My mind isn't a material thing, right? Or the mind of God, right? This is powerful evidence for God. Now, these guys that are saying, information comes from the cells, again, they're just so reluctant to point to anything beyond.
Well, they're saying that, that cells have information in them, but even in
it's kind of like, to me, they're saying like a table has, that's the source of it. Something inanimate, doesn't.
Right.
Sorry.
But even to say things have information is to say that there's a mind. And as soon as you say there's a mind, then you have to say, well, what's the evidence? And you have to start weighing the evidence for that mind. And then who is that mind? What is that mind?
Yeah.
And you can go to animism, you can go to pantheism, but ultimately you will end up with the creator.
You will. And Paul makes this really clear in Romans chapter 1. He says, just looking at God's creation, looking at a human eye, for example, and the complexity and the beauty of that, and the fact that it's designed for a purpose, right? It's Paul says, just the creation itself points to God in a way that, is undeniable. And to deny God as a creator when you see the evidence in creation is to be kind of willingly suppressing the truth. Like you want to suppress it. You see it clearly. And I think we all know this at some level, It's funny, children often have this kind of faith. They know right away, as they grow up, they this didn't all just happen by chance. You have to almost be kind of overly educated. But I wanted to get back to your question on the culture and what difference this makes in shaping cultures too, Dwight, because I think that's a really important question. These words are building blocks of culture. So what kind of cultures do high faith culture, what does that look like? A culture is built on a true understanding of faith. And when I was thinking about that, I thought of Darrow's famous quote, we all build societies in the image of the God that we worship, right? So if you believe in a let's say, an animistic kind of a worldview where the world is governed by these pagan gods who are erratic, they're unpredictable, you're always trying to kind of do these spells and incantations or whatever it is, and to kind of control the gods. They're not trustworthy. And so when you have that as the basis of a culture, you have a low trust society, and that tends to lead to a lot of dysfunction, corruption, brokenness. You can't trust each other because you can't ultimately trust the gods, if you will. So that's an animistic kind of a culture. What about a culture that's, like our Western cultures that are materialistic? They don't believe in any spiritual reality, right? Well, then what do you have? You have this kind of Darwinian idea of, everything was formed through blind chance, and, there's only kind of one immutable law, the survival of the fittest. Well, if that's the only immutable law, right, we're all just kind of in this battle to survive and pass on our genes, then we also can't trust each other, right? Because you're always going to be trying to take advantage of me for your benefit, right? If everything is just a blind chance, we can't even trust our own thinking about it, right? How can I trust my brain to know the truth about anything if it just happened through this unguided process of evolution? So you have low trust there as well, right? And Marxism too, low trust, because the Marxist idea is that everyone's out, to seek advantage, to seek power over other people for their own benefit, right? And so you can't trust people there either. So it's really fascinating. If you want to have a high trust society where you can trust other people, you can trust the institutions of society, you can trust that the next election is going to be free and fair. We all need society kind of functions on this trust. It's super important. You have to ask the question, where does that trust come from? And I think ultimately it comes from It has to come from the worship of the living God, who is true and trustworthy and real and doesn't change, and is, we can fully trust in him. So then we can, if we trust in him, we can become people that are like him, kind of trustworthy people, and then we can build institutions that are trustworthy, right? That are reliable.
And we
Does that make sense? I know I'm getting, but
no.
It turns out that this word faith is kind of super important for building healthy cultures.
No, you touched on something there, because if to trust in a trustworthy God, also then we realize that, okay, God exists, he created us, we are made in his image.
Yeah.
So at every man's core is the desire to be a trustworthy person.
That's right.
Because that's who God is.
That's who
now,
God
we
is.
aren't, and we
Yes.
fall short, and we're fallen creatures. But that's,
and the more that I grow in my faith, the more trustworthy I become, the more honest, and the more I have integrity.
Exactly.
Yeah. My wife can trust me. My kids can trust me. That means my family's stronger, and it's such a basic building block. We just trust and faith, so, these things really matter at the end of the day. So,
and it's everywhere. Business,
it's
sports,
everywhere. Businesses, sports, everywhere. That's right. That's right.
Food production.
Yeah. Yep. Food production. The one that I'm struggling with right now is post-COVID is was the Food and Drug Administration, right? I mean, 15 years ago, I'd like complete trust in that, oh yeah, whatever they say, any vaccine, whatever it is, I'm completely going to get that because they're completely trustworthy. Then comes COVID and this COVID vaccine, and I'm like, well, maybe we should give that a little more time. It's brand new. Let's see what the evidence is for that. And now it's like, I wouldn't trust them at all.
Uh-oh.
True confession.
Sorry to say that, but they've lost my trust. They've lost my
faith.
trust. Yeah. So,
Back to faith. You've lost faith.
Yeah, right.
There's definitely a huge wave of skepticism right now when it comes to all that, thanks to COVID. Hopefully we don't overreact and have no trust in it.
So you're tying that to
the
the false definition of this word faith.
Well, it just, you have societies where trust is eroded because people, can I trust that you truly have my best interests at mind in these agencies? Or are you really just looking to make a whole lot of money? And that's what it appears like, because there's this revolving door in that case between these huge pharmaceutical companies that make billions of dollars and these people that are, on these FDA approval boards that are approving the drugs, right? Like, so too many conflicts of interest there. I'm sorry, you're going to have to show me a better, I need better evidence that I can trust you right now is what it boils down to. So trust, once it's lost, by the way, it's hard to rebuild, isn't it? I mean, we all know that in our experience.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, this is, what else, guys? I think we're kind of coming to the end, I think, of this, but...
Yeah, I have never realized how much we need faith in a society for it to work.
Yep.
That's pretty eye-opening how necessary that is. I mean, it makes sense. I like that show Survivor, that TV or game show. Mm-hmm. And they always say the one thing you need on the island is trust.
Yes.
You can't get anywhere in the game without trust. And it's a mini society. It's a little, case study of the broader society, but humans cannot work in community without trust.
It's such a basic building block.
Acting upon it in faith. Yeah.
And again, it just begs the question, where does trust come from? How can I exercise faith in you and trust you? Where do you become trustworthy, or the institution that you build, where does that become trustworthy? And you just keep pushing back, and it has to have its source in a God who is utterly trustworthy. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that at the foundation of it all, you're going to have low trust societies. And I think that's the great news. That's the great contribution of God and of true biblical faith, if you will, for a culture. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Anything else you guys want to share before we wrap up? That was pretty good ending, though.
Yeah, I just that last comment, Scott. I was even thinking of life as a human being, as a person. It's like ultimately, the more I trust in God, the more confidence I have as a human being.
That's right.
Because without that, you're always worried about failure. You're worried about harm. You're worried about loss. You're worried about everything, and then you don't function well. Then you can't be a giving, loving.
No, that's right.
But
it's just
trust
such
in
a
God
basic
is
need.
as a good creator who loves us and cares for us. It just builds everything. You're right.
It does.
Yeah. Back to marriage, I think of how a healthy marriage requires faith, and when there's a breakdown in faithfulness, a common, response to that is jealousy. And jealousy, once that's introduced into a marriage, it just causes cracks to spread everywhere. And there's all of a sudden there's no trust, and there's a complete
connect that a
lack
little
of
bit
faith.
more for me, Luke. How do you see jealousy brought in here? I'm not quite sure I'm following that.
Yeah, I mean, this is more for relationships specifically, but once there's a lack of faith, I no longer trust that you're faithful. Okay, now I'm jealous of something or someone out there that is causing this lack of faithfulness. And it might be real, it might be not, but now jealousy has creeped in. And once jealousy enters a marriage, it starts affecting everything, because it's such it's so contagious or so contaminating. And all of a sudden I don't trust what you're saying, and I don't trust where you're at, and I don't trust what you're doing, and our kids don't trust us, and they don't know whose side to take, and it breaks everything down really quickly. So that's just an example of once it's broken, it's hard to restore, and it causes just turmoil in all different directions.
There's an interesting other side while we're talking about the importance of trust in our human relationships. There's another side to it that I've always found kind of fascinating, and that is you see this, for example, with God, in the story of Gideon, that Old Testament story, where Gideon is this kind of flaky guy who is very fearful, and yet God comes to him, and he's got a plan. He's going to do something powerful through Gideon. He's going to use him to overthrow the Midianites. But he comes to him and he says, what does he say? Courageous man of God, or great man of God, or something like that. Something that's not true, really.
He was hiding at the time.
He's hiding. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's hiding in fear. And God looks beyond what he is to what he can be. And that faith in him, even though it's unwarranted, it's actually helps him become that. And I've seen that with Luke, you, and the other kids, that you and I've seen it with myself. Like, in other words, if somebody has faith in who I can become, not what I am, it actually helps me to become more trustworthy. More.
Oh yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So this guy, that's kind of a blind leap of faith.
Faith breeds faith.
Yeah.
No,
maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. Faith breeds. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
And we want to start with that. You give trust, and then you hope people to live into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't doubt someone else. You hope for the best in them. I think of that with a running coach I used to have. And before a race, he would always say, Luke, I think you can run this time. And I would want to rise to the occasion because he had faith that I could do it. And I'm like, I don't know what you see in me, coach, but I'm way more motivated now to try extra hard to prove that your faith wasn't void.
That requires some more thought on my part. I just found that very, very powerful, though, and very, So, anyways, we're probably drifting off a little bit here, but.
Okay, yeah, let's wrap things up. Yeah, this was fun though, guys. And thank you guys to all of our listeners for tuning in as well. I hope that was helpful for you guys. I hope that you can walk away from this being able to push back next time you hear that faith is merely blind, and you'll have a response to that. And I also hope that all of us as Christians can always be pushing for evidence, asking questions, searching for the heart of God. We have full permission to do that as Christians, which is amazing, and we can do that for the rest of our lives. And when we come up face to face with the decision to assent to the weight of evidence or not, don't be a postmodernist or deconstructionist, but actually, have some faith and continue to lean into God. And test other worldviews as well. There's only one worldview that comports with reality, but if you want to see if Buddhism does, go and ask questions, search for evidence. As far as I can tell, it does not comport with reality, but as Christians, we should be always looking for truth and being confident in the evidence that leads to the biblical worldview. We definitely are, and this book lays out the biblical worldview definitions of these 10 important words. Again, those words are, or I don't think I've read them yet today, but those words in this book that we're unpacking are truth, human, sex, marriage, freedom, authority, justice, faith, beauty, and love. So in this mini-series, we only have 2 more episodes, which is kind of sad, beauty and love, but those are going to be power-packed episodes. We're excited to bring those to you guys. If you have not listened to the other words in this series, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to those. We also have an introduction episode, which is a great one for you guys to share with any friends who you think would benefit from this series to get them going on the project. Also, for all things 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, the book that we are unpacking here, we have a website for you guys that has all the information you can need about the book. That website is 10wordsbook.org. Again, that is 10wordsbook.org. On there, you'll see the endorsements about the book. You'll see the introduction, the trailer for the book, and we also have more information about how to access the Bible study course once that comes out in November, at the same time as the book comes out, hopefully. By the way, the book will be out on November 19th, which is coming up very soon. If you would like to be notified for when that book comes out, you can join our newsletter at disciplenations.org. There's an obvious place on our homepage to sign up for our newsletter, and we're going to send out a reminder that the book is out on November 19th, so you can feel free to sign up for the newsletter there. Again, all things 10 Words Book, go to 10wordsbook.org. So yeah, that's it for today, guys. Dad, Dwight, thank you for your time. I enjoyed the discussion. And we'll catch all of you guys next week for another episode here on Ideas Have Consequences, the podcast of the Disciple Nations Alliance.